Hello. So it's the end of February. I haven't made much videos because it's been very cold and snowy. So there's not really much to see, even though living things are definitely still around. They're just hiding under the ground or have been buried in snow for a long time. So it's finally been up in the 40s and 50s lately, so all the snow is melted, making a swampy, muddy ground and above freezing temperatures. So we can see things around. Things aren't really coming out of hibernation yet, and mushrooms really aren't blooming yet. So I figured I would take this time to just go over some places where you could find mushrooms and insects and other cool critters this spring. So let's get started. This decaying log here is a perfect example of what's called brown rot. So at the beginning of a mushroom's life cycle, when the spore first lands on its nutrient source, such as what this tree used to be, it's going to be growing there for a long time and digesting and using the nutrients so that it can grow, and eventually it will build up enough energy so that it can produce fruiting bodies and reproduce, because that takes a lot of energy for any species to reproduce. When they colonize the tree that they're on, they need to digest the tree, so they start by releasing a chemical that digests the tree, and then once it's digested, they take in the nutrients and use them to grow their bodies and metabolize. The particular chemical that they use is something called cellulose and also hemicellulose. So that's a type of sugar that's very nutritious, and that's what makes trees very hard to break. So our bodies are not capable of digesting cellulose, evidenced by the fact that we can't eat trees. So what happens is, the three main sources, really good sources of food for mushrooms, is cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. But certain types of mushrooms are only able to digest cellulose and hemicellulose, which leaves behind lignin. Now, lignin is a structural molecule that doesn't really fit into any, I don't think it really perfectly fits into any, sugar or fat or protein or anything like that. It's just its own macromolecule. And what lignin does is it gives a tree its stiffness, and it also is brown in color. So when they leave behind the lignin, the wood left behind is going to be brown or reddish brown. And it's going to be easy to break. It will be crumbly. It has this kind of blocky look to it. So this tree is already very well digested, and they broke off. So, I could just pick a piece off easily. And I'm not very closely related to the Hulk, so I'm not able to break trees off normally. So this thing is very decayed and weakened. You can see it's very stiff too, even though these are wet, which trees become more spongy when they were wet. They're still very hard. So certain types of mushrooms produce brown rot, and this is what it looks like. So if you see a tree that looks like this, this is a better example of what maybe a more active one would look like. This is brown rot over here. You might, if you monitor this the whole season, you're probably going to find some type of mushroom growing out of it at some point. You can't tell exactly what kind just by looking at it. You have to wait for it to bloom. But there's going to be some types of mushrooms that produce this. If you look at this stuff over here, this is already too far gone. There's probably not going to be much here because the mushrooms have already digested all the good nutrients in there. And you can see the process of decomposition. You got this big log here. It has this bark on it still. And then you look closer, and it's starting to decay. You could easily break a piece off of it if you wanted to. And then it's broken down into these smaller chips. And down here, you can see that it's actually turning into soil. This is like soil. And then if you were to dig deeper, you could see actual soil that's been there for a long time. So this is the important role that mushrooms play in decomposition, and it's also a good way to identify whether or not mushrooms are present in that area. This is an example of another kind of decomposition that was performed by some type of fungus here on this log, which is called white rot. So white rot is going to leave this whitish appearance, but this one down here got wet and dirty, so that's why it's brown. What happens in white rot is that instead of using hydrogen peroxide like brown rot does, they use an enzyme that specifically is meant for breaking down the tree, so it's able to do a lot more damage to the tree. So this one can digest cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. So you can see that the brown pigment from the lignin is gone, and that's why it stays white. And it's not very structurally sound. I could just rip off a piece, as you can see, because it's already been digested, as well as the fact that it doesn't have the stiffness that lignin gives it. So I could just press my finger in it and make an indentation. And it's very spongy, and it kind of, instead of having a blocky appearance, it has more of an appearance like, you know, it's been shredded. Like it went through a shredder and just little splinters come off of it. And this is going to be the more common type of decomposition that you see for mushrooms. So once again, if you were to observe this for the whole season, you're probably going to find at least some type of fungus on it. You never know which, but yeah. And then once again, you can see the various levels of decomposition. Like this here is some solid wood still. You can still knock on it and it makes a sound. And then as you move deeper in, it's breaking apart into wood chips. And you can see the part where it's actually starting to grow into soil, to turn into soil. So there's another example of what something would look like if there was mushrooms growing on it. Now, it's not always going to be this obvious and this profound. And if you do find something that looks this profound, there's a good chance as well that it's too far gone and you're not going to find much growing on it. But you just look for little subtle hints. The whole thing isn't going to be decomposed like this. You're going to look for something that has a little piece of it that's like that. But it looks good for the most part, and those will be the best logs to look for stuff. Like this one. It still looks pretty good. It has its bark on it, but you can see that it also has brown rot. I think this would be a good one to look for mushrooms on if it was the right season. So if we were to apply what we learned about white rot and brown rot on this big tree over here that's been dead for a long time, you can take a look at it. You can see it has this end of it. It has this brown, very blocky appearance, and it's brittle. You could crack pieces off of it. That's brown rot. But then you come over on the other side, and you can see there's this brown area or white area that is very soft and squishy in the moister parts, and it comes apart in splinters. It doesn't have that blocky appearance. So this is a dead log that has been dead for a while, but it still has some pretty good nutrients left in it. There's some parts that aren't really rotted much that, you know, I can't take any piece off or anything. So it's plenty of good nutrients. So you would expect, since this has brown rot and white rot, that there's going to be a variety of different mushrooms that are living here during various parts of the season. You could see some that are old. They didn't just bloom. They're old, then they're left over from last year. The mustard yellow polypore right here. You can see some more of that here. This one's more dried out, so it's lighter in color. And then you got this violet tooth polypore. And then over here, these actually look fresher. This is... Oops. Here's a cool thing that I found that I've never seen before. This is a big, huge mass of mycelium that has just engulfed a bunch of leaf litter, and it looks like it used to be part of a log. It was filling some hole in a log until it eventually broke off. So I'm not exactly sure what this is, but if anyone knows what this might be, just put it in the comments. Another way to find mushrooms is to look for ones that don't just decay dead wood, but also are parasitic to living wood. So you might want to find a very sickly looking tree like this one. If you look up, you can see that one of its very large branches has fallen off. So this one's either very sick or it's already dead. I don't know how to tell. And it would be easier to tell which ones are sick during like the summer and the spring, because they won't grow nice leaves like the other ones. And you could also see that, you know, some of the bark came off down here, and if you look in closer, there's some compromised structural integrity in there. So this might be a good place to look for mushrooms, because one of the causes of death or sickness to the tree could be that there's a parasitic mushroom that's growing on it. And then, after that mushroom kills it, there's going to be more funguses that are going to grow on it that decay the dead wood. So there's going to be ones that like living wood, and they kill them. And then once it dies, there's going to be a bunch of fungus that likes dead wood. So some places to look. Poking out of the bark, you might find something. And then there's little holes where the branches were. I can't find any right now. But here, look at this tree. If that hole, once that branches fall, there'll be a hole there. A lot of elm oyster mushrooms might want to pop out of that. And then a bunch of other mushrooms, like regular oyster mushrooms, also grow on the bark of the tree. Another good place to look for them is around the base of it, because there's a good chance that there's some fungus that is growing out of the roots of the tree. And one example of a mushroom whose season is coming up soon, and we're all excited, that does this type of decaying, is parasitic on living trees and feeds down the roots and comes up. That would be the morel mushroom. And also, this is a very fertile place, because as you can see, there's a lot of manure around in the soil that's fertilizing the soil. So overall, this would be a great place to look for mushrooms if they're there. You can already see there's a little something growing here. I'm not exactly sure what that is. And then if you look here, this is a large branch that fell off of it. And you can see there's a bunch of mushrooms growing on it. So this would be a very fertile tree to look at. I couldn't tell you if it's dying or if it's dead. And also, I don't know what species this is. I can tell based on leaves, but people that are like experts and know a lot more could just tell by the bark. But I'm not quite at that place yet. So you might look for mushrooms that prefer oak or maple or elm, which I wouldn't be able to tell you in this one, but there might be something growing down here. I can't tell the species, so I couldn't tell you what type of things might like this. And then there's one more thing to say about the color of the decaying wood. If you see a dead wood like this, and it's got this greenish, bluish color, and it looks like it's brown rot with the greenish bluish, this is a telltale sign of a specific species of mushroom called Chlorosiboria aeruginosa, or the turquoise elf cup, I think is the common name. So if you see this bluish color, I don't know exactly the chemistry behind it, but you can be sure that there's a specific species growing on it, Chlorosiboria aeruginosa. And the mycelium, at least, are going to be here. And if you were to monitor this tree throughout the year, you would see these little greenish blue cup fungus blooming. If you wonder what insects do during the winter, a lot of them will migrate, so they don't want to experience the cold, so they go to a different part of the world that's colder. But there's also a lot of them that live here over winter. They either go deep down in the ground, where it's less likely to freeze, which is why you don't really see a lot of insects. And some of them are actually very cold tolerant, and they're able to freeze, either because their cells are able to, like humans, if our bodies were to freeze, water expands when it freezes, so our cells would burst. But some insect cells can handle that expansion, and they can become frozen. And some of them produce chemicals in their body that prevent them from freezing, even though the external temperature is above freezing. And still others will excrete like almost all the water out of their body before the freezing temperatures come, so that when they freeze and the water expands, it won't be that much expansion, and they'll still be able to live. So some animals will stay to the upper surface of the soil over the winter and find a nice sheltered place, like under a log. And an example of one of these insects that is extremely cold tolerant is this. This is a woolly bear caterpillar. He's been sitting here all winter and just in a dormant state. So he's not eating or anything. Insects have an ability to really decrease all their metabolism and make it so they spend very little energy and need very little oxygen during the winter, so they don't have to eat. And this is one of the ones that is very cold tolerant. I believe it's one of the ones that produces chemicals in his body that act as antifreeze. So even though the external temperatures are very cold, the insect cells do not freeze. So that's an example of what the woolly bears do during the winter. If you're trying to find aquatic animals, like fish, I can't help you, but there are some amphibians and insects that I could help you with. Some insects are aquatic for at least part of their life. They spend at least part of their life cycle in the water, so you can find them a lot near water, as well as amphibians who spend part of their life cycle in the water and part of it on land. So right here would be a good place. We got the Des Plaines River over here, and we're on land, so this might be a good place to look for amphibians. Come spring and fall, spring and early summer, it's going to be the mating season for a lot of different animals, including frogs. So frogs in their adulthood, they live on land, and when they're babies, they live on water, which means during their mating season, they have to be somewhere that's on land but really close to water. So over here in this vegetation, there's a lot of places to hide. They're protected from predators, as well as a lot of food sources for them. So you might find some males calling out here looking for females. And then once they find their female, they're going to have to vacate to the water because their eggs have to be laid in water and their whole mating thing has to be done in water. So during mating season, you might want to look along the banks of rivers. They're going to be calling at night. I find that, especially for smaller frogs like cricket frogs, I almost always find males because you could hear them calling out, even though you can't see them. So if you follow them by their sound, then you'll find them. But the females are harder to find because there's no sound to follow. So this is where I might look if I was looking for frogs. Another thing about frogs is that, the ones that are mostly terrestrial you might find over in that patch of vegetation. Things like American toads and Fowler's toads and tree frogs. But for ones that are mostly aquatic, they like to spend most of their time in water, even through their adulthood, like bullfrogs and green frogs. You might want to just look for them along the edge of this. You can find them basking in the sunlight on rocks or logs. And then, of course, you'll always find the eggs in water somewhere, as well as the tadpoles. Another thing is that this is a river. It's a permanent body of water. And only certain frogs like to lay their eggs in permanent bodies of water, which this wouldn't be a very good place to lay them. They like to do it near where there's a lot of vegetation so that they don't just get snatched up and eaten. But, you might find some bullfrog and green frog and American toadheads here. But for other types of frogs, like mostly tree frogs, they're going to want to lay their eggs in things called vernal pools, which means that in the springtime there's a lot of rainfall and it floods and maybe there's a big pool of water over there. They're going to lay their eggs, they're quickly going to hatch and grow into adults and get out of there, and then that vernal pool is going to dry up. So that's going to be earlier in the spring that those frogs are going to do that. So if you're looking for bullfrogs and green frogs and American toads, you might want to look in a river. But for other frogs, such as tree frogs, which I really don't find a lot of tree frogs. I'm not very good at climbing trees, but I've seen a couple of them in my life. For tree frogs, you're going to want to look in vernal pools, places that don't really have water in them for most of the year, just a small sliver of the year. Another cool thing you can find outside is reptiles, which in this case pretty much means snakes. I know we have lizards here in Illinois, but I've never seen any in this area, so I don't know. But as far as snakes go, when you look for them, you can either find them out basking in the sun. Otherwise, you kind of gotta look around a little bit in vegetation or turning over logs or rocks. But the problem with that is that when you do that, you don't really know what you're gonna get until it jumps out at you. Which in Illinois, I know we have like 4 species of venomous snakes, but I don't know. I don't want to spread information here, but I think maybe they either live in a different part of Illinois, like more southern or central, or maybe I just got lucky and never found them, or that they're very rare. But I've honestly never encountered a venomous snake here. So I don't think I feel pretty safe doing what I do. But maybe if you're in other parts of the United States or other parts of the world, you might not want to look around for snakes like that. Another great place to find all sorts of things is in vegetation. Vegetation offers a lot of protection from predators, a lot of hiding places, and a lot of food sources. Not just for animals that eat certain types of plants, but also for animals that eat those plants. So if you just take a couple of steps through some vegetation like this, you might find some frogs jumping out, like the terrestrial frogs, such as the American toad or the leopard frog. You'll probably see some insects flying out, something like a grasshopper later in the year. And you see some snakes slithering out, like the garter snake. Those are all sorts of things that love to live in vegetation. So if I see some low to the ground vegetation that looks nice, not something like this that's all thorny, and not something like this. I think this is sawgrass. I'm pretty sure. I can't tell, but you wouldn't want to go walking through sawgrass. If you just take a couple steps in there, you'll find that all sorts of things are living in there, and you see them jump out. No matter what you're looking for, a great thing to do is turn over logs. There you'll find all kinds of insects and possibly some reptiles and amphibians, and some mushrooms. The mushrooms are there because they like the wood that they're feeding on. If you turn over a log, you're probably going to find some mycelia that you're not normally able to see from the top of the log, or some small fungus. I find that it's usually cup fungus or crust fungus that I find, as well as plenty of insects like to live underground, particularly insect larvae. You can see 2 insect larvae. I don't know exactly what kind they are. And then there's a little insect crawling over there, even in this cold weather. This white stuff might be the mycelia of some mushroom. And you'll also find snakes and frogs hiding under here too, because they like to take cover from the rest of the world. And then if you're looking for insects and reptiles and amphibians, but not mushrooms, then you are also going to want to turn over rocks. You'll find a lot of stuff under there too. So turning over logs is a fun activity, no matter what you're doing. And some insects live specifically underground. Like when it comes cicada season, if you turn over logs, you're probably going to find a lot of holes like this, with cicada heads popping out. That's leftover from last year. But there's plenty of insects that live underground, particularly larvae that live underground. And another thing that insects do over winter is that maybe sometimes all of the insects die off except for one stage of the life cycle. So maybe they lay their eggs and everyone else dies and the eggs live, or only the larva or the pupa, or sometimes even only the adults live. And then those ones grow up and reproduce for the next generation. So that could also be a possibility. And a lot of them you're going to find underground or under logs during the winter. Along riverbanks is a good place to look for all sorts of things as well. Of course, so you find out basking on rocks, some snakes, some banded water snakes, some frogs and turtles. Another thing I found is that when there's a big algal bloom, which usually is harmful to an ecosystem, but I find that when there's a big algal bloom, there's all sorts of water snakes and crawdads that are living in there, which I'm probably because it's a good place to hide from predators. But yeah, I don't know about that. It's just my own personal experience. Also, on a log or a tree that's growing right out at the edge of the riverbank, you're gonna find some mushrooms too, because mushrooms like moisture. In particular, the tiger sawgill is one that you'll find. And then, if you turn over rocks, there's just all kinds of things that live under rocks. There's nothing right now, but of course you could find, crawdads and things that are hiding under there, frogs. But I have also found these little things, I don't even know what they are, like different types of aquatic worms and snails and crustaceans that I don't even know what they are, but they're really cool. So sometime on a bright sunny day this summer, try and take a rock from the river and turn it over. And there's all kinds of neat things under there that I couldn't even tell you what they are. And then another thing is our aquatic insects, particularly dragonflies, damselflies, mayflies. Those ones lay their eggs in the water, and they live out their entire nymph life underwater. And then when they become adults, they live on land and fly around, but they hang out near the water mostly because they're predators and they like to eat small aquatic animals. And they also like to reproduce in the water as well. So those are some things you can find at the edge of the water. And of course, if there's still water, not like a river, you're going to find lots of mosquitoes as well. So here I am discussing all these rules of where to look, where to find stuff. But, there's always exceptions to that. Mushrooms, you can find them growing out of the ground, not necessarily feeding on wood or roots, but just feeding on general decaying plant matter down there. There's plenty of insects that, they're just going to be buzzing around you all the time. There's not a specific place to look for them. Some mushrooms, specifically grow on oak trees or maple trees or one type of thing. Some of them grow out of walnuts. Some of them grow on other types of fungus. And, so there's going to be exceptions for every rule. So I'm just kind of giving a guide of where to look. But no matter where you are or what you're doing, always keep your eyes peeled and you'll see all kinds of cool stuff. Of course, look for your specialists like the milkweed with monarch butterflies or the ailanthus webworm moth on the ailanthus tree. Stuff like that. But, yeah. The purpose of this, I just want people to, get out there and go look for stuff. As long as you're keeping your eyes peeled, you're going to find something. But, yeah, those are just a couple of rules to guide you. So have fun foraging and looking around this spring and summer.